Wartide, a card game set in a world where the barriers between three different realities begin to break down and the factions within those realities now struggle for dominance. Pick your faction and fight for survival and dominance of the multiverse. It's one thing to have faith in God, to believe that He's there. It's something else entirely to know that God is with you, because you can literally hear His voice in your head, telling you what to do and what to say all the time. This was the god of the faction that would one day become known as the Null. Not only was he the creator of their world, not only was he the divinity from which all things flow, he was the guy that literally dictated your life. And for a long while, everyone liked it that way. Life was harmonious. No one had to worry about angst or fears or doubts as to who they were, why they were here, and what they ought to do. Because all they had to do was open their minds and hearts and pray, and God would provide the answers. Everything from big existential questions like, what is my purpose in life, to small, more immediate things like, what should I say next in a conversation? The Great One would always be listening, and he would often respond with the answer. With all such burdens of personal responsibility lifted from their shoulders, the people were content, in some ways even happy. And so, if and when the Great One demanded something of them, they more than willingly obliged him. The Great One, though benign and even benevolent, was a god of the void. Nothingness was his greatest ideal. And so when his devotees made offerings to him, they would literally offer bits of themselves. They would go to the nearest temple, in which lay a literal void, a manifestation of their god, and they would throw their offerings into the void. It could be anything from a toe to an entire arm, so long as the Great One told them that it was okay to make this offering. For no acolyte would make a sacrifice of any kind without first getting his permission and approval. Many among the Null longed to sacrifice of themselves to him, because to them it was like sharing literally part of themselves with their god. Sacrificing a body part to the void meant that a part of them was literally now one with him. And of course, if a follower wished to offer of himself or herself in their entirety to the Great One, and he accepted, then they would simply jump into the void and become nothingness, joining in every particular with the god. It was something that many a devotee of the Null longed for. But the sacrifices needn't be something physical. For example, one priestess of the void had made sacrifices of a more emotional and even spiritual sense to him. She had sacrificed her griefs, her dreams, her loves. She'd even given up her name to the Great One. She had made of herself by the end nothing more than a vessel of his will, and a vessel needs no name of its own. She was simply the priestess of the void, one of many temple leaders who answered only to the Great One and his high priest. More than anything else, the priestess of the void longed to make the final offering, to throw herself into the void and become one with her god. But every time she prayed, he would always say, "Not today." Thus it had been with the Null in general, until the heresy of free will. No one knows how it started, but one day, a crowd of people gathered before the temple of the high priest. They knelt in the square, and they prayed to their god to be allowed to use their own minds and wills. They prayed that he would not have to direct everything they did and said. The high priest, kept alive for centuries by the power of his god, is now the only one of the Null left living who remembers that day. For 3 days the heretics prayed thus to the god, and at first the voice in his head was one of confusion. The Great One simply couldn't understand why any of his followers would want less of his presence in their minds and in their lives. For 3 days the god tried to argue with his followers, but they insisted that they wanted to be free. By the 3rd day, confusion had given way to betrayal, and betrayal to wrath. The sky went dark. The sun went out, replaced by a giant orange eye glaring down at the heretics in the square. And then, bit by bit, the square simply fell away into the darkness, collapsing downwards into an endless void. None of the heretics survived. Those who tried to leap across the gap to safety were snatched by tendrils of the god's power and dragged down. Soon enough, the last heretic fell silent, and there was a gaping hole where the square before the cathedral had once been. For a while the god was silent, and all feared. Never before had the god been so quiet this long. Without his voice giving them instructions, many didn't know what to do with themselves. But soon the voice returned. But it was clear that the frenzied anger had not abated. The Great One demanded that all heretics should be expunged from existence, that all who dared deny him should cease to be. And so other sections of the world, indeed the universe, disappeared, along with any heretic who dared express the idea of free will. The high priest and all the other clerics of the faith led their devout in prayer for supplication to the god. This was their punishment for allowing the heresy to grow among them, that henceforth they must keep faith, and then, when the last heretic was expunged, their god's anger would cease, and his warmth and love would return once more. That was centuries ago, and the old high priest, kept alive by his god, is still waiting for that day when his anger will finally cool. And so for centuries, the Great One continued to hunt the minds of all humans on his world for heretics. And whenever he found one, whenever he found even the slightest whiff of heresy, he would obliterate another corner of his world. The various worlds of the multiverse are like bubbles packed together. And the more of his world that the Great One destroyed, the more the barrier around his world grew thin and weak as it expanded to try and fill in the new gaps that he had created. And so it was the god of the Null, in his endless search for heretics to destroy, that began the process of weakening the barriers between worlds. Then there was the Kagawa and their prolific use of warp technology. And finally, the transdimensional radio signal of Empira, the straw that broke the multiversal camel's back. On that day, every inch of ground suddenly shook, and for a brief moment, the god's voice was silent. His faithful were filled with fear. Once again, without his will to tell them what to do, they were completely lost. But then the Great One's voice returned, filled with righteous wrath. He had found heretics. Heretics across a breach in reality. It didn't matter that they were not of his world. They were people who denied him. And so he commanded the faithful to go forth and destroy all that would not accept the will of the Null. The Null are by far the creepiest faction of Wartide. An army of fanatics that have willingly given themselves over to the control of a deity that, while once benign, has taken on aspects that are more at home among the old gods of Lovecraft. A divine control freak that cannot abide the idea that anyone might not want to be an instrument of his will. The Null need not worry about morale, and the powers and abilities that it and its servants may manifest is beyond the comprehension of either the Kagawa or Empira. To the Great One, it matters not what they look like or where they're from. They will either accept him into their minds and hearts, or they will suffer the fate of all heretics. All came from nothingness. And if these new heretics will not accept him, then to nothingness they shall return.